Hi, I'm Celeste Dolan, and I'm be reading my paper, Human Trafficking, Capitalizing on Conditions of Critical Need. Human trafficking can be defined as any act of buying, selling, and exploiting human beings for the purpose of gaining profit. An estimated 27.6 million people worldwide have fallen victim to human trafficking. This illegal act takes two primary forms, which are sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Sex trafficking is when a person is forced or tricked into a sex act in exchange for money. This type of trafficking makes up about 23% of all 27.6 million victims. Labor trafficking, often dubbed modern-day slavery, is when a person is forced or pressured into working or providing services for which they do not receive equitable compensation. This form of trafficking accounts for around 77% of all human trafficking victims. Victims of human trafficking are usually those living on the margins of society, whether that is in poverty, homelessness, a history of abandonment or sexual abuse, or a long list of additional issues. Human trafficking is an issue that needs to be immediately addressed due to its commonality and the way it disproportionately harms society's most vulnerable members. Real solutions require attacking the problem at hand, which means confronting the various types of systems that make people defenseless targets of human trafficking. Poverty and poverty-related issues are the most common causes for why someone may be a human trafficking target. Traffickers capitalize on the critical need of impoverished people that they are unable to meet. For example, a trafficker may see that someone cannot afford the food that they need to provide them sustenance, so they convince this person to perform a particular act, like manual labor, for food in return. Human trafficking can happen to people of all genders and ages, but they are all tied together by this common thread, which is some sort of vulnerability. These poverty-related issues include, but are not limited to, a lack of education, homelessness, abandonment by family, a history of abuse or mental health struggles, and unemployment. Personal accounts of human trafficking are some of the most compelling forms of information on the topic, and should be more often shared to educate communities, especially those most susceptible. The University of Michigan's Human Trafficking Collaborations video titled Human Trafficking Survivor Stories shares the stories of people who were victims of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Deborah, one of the human trafficking survivors featured in this video, describes the circumstances she was in when she became a target. She was only 13 years old when she was brought into the world of sex trafficking. Deborah was a target due to her young age and familial instability, as she spent years within the foster system. Deborah's trafficker took advantage of her history of abandonment and filled the role of a constant in her life, which she had always longed for. Kwame, on the other survivor in the video, was a 7-year-old immigrant from Africa who was taken advantage of by a family friend. He was forced to do unpaid labor and threatened with deportation if he told anyone. Kwame came from an impoverished family, and at such a young age didn't know any better than just to follow orders. He didn't want to risk losing the improved life that was promised to him in America. The most vulnerable and impoverished members of society fall victim to human trafficking because they are offered a solution to something that they desperately need. People often confuse human trafficking and street prostitution, more commonly referred to as sex work. While these are similar issues, there are a few significant fundamental differences. A person who engages in sex work is someone whose labor or livelihood includes the selling or trading of sexual conduct for money or other goods of value. On the other hand, someone who is subject to human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, is forced or tricked into engaging in commercial sexual activities for the gain of another person, the trafficker. Therefore, the crime of trafficking can be experienced by sex workers, but not all people in the sex trade are trafficked. While it is important to acknowledge these differences, it is also critical to point out the struggles shared by these groups. Jacqueline Monroe's Woman in Street Prostitution, the Result of Poverty and the Brunt of Inequity, highlights the common thread that connects both of these groups. That is commonly the situation of poverty that they are living in, either when they turn to sex work as a profession or are taken advantage of by means of human trafficking. Monroe argues that low wages in the United States are one of the main contributors to poverty, especially for women and minorities, and therefore considerably contribute to the number of people who turn to sex work as a means of livable wage. Victims of sex trafficking often share these conditions, since the majority of victims are women of color. Another similarity emphasized in Monroe's writing is the idea of a tragic choice that both sex workers and victims of human trafficking have to make. Usually, it is the case that a sex worker does not want to go into that profession, but they feel that it is their only option to make enough money to support themselves and their family. Victims of sex trafficking don't necessarily have a choice to enter their situation, but the tragic choice that they have to make is to stay or leave. If they stay, they have to endure awful things like sexual and mental abuse, but if they attempt to leave, repercussions are most likely worse, such as harm to their family or deportation. As a result, many victims have to make the tragic choice to stay. While sex work and sex trafficking are two different things, the issues at the forefront are the same: poverty and inequality. While human trafficking is undoubtedly a serious issue, some people do not see it as of the utmost importance. They argue that there are other issues far more urgent than combating human trafficking. Those who agree with this idea might say that people end up in situations of human trafficking because they are too lazy to find a real job. This is simply untrue. Human traffickers use tactics of force, fraud, and coercion to convince victims that what they are signing up for is a real job. Victims are commonly told that once they start working for their trafficker, they will be paid, but when they never receive this money, they realize it is a trap. Usually, once the victim notices this, it is too late to escape. They are forced to stay because the consequences otherwise are far worse, like threats of deportation or torture. Others don't even get a chance to agree to the tasks expected of them. But again, they are left with no choice because what happens if they do not perform these tasks is much worse. Additionally, whether an issue is urgent enough to focus on is mainly subjective. Someone who has been personally affected by human trafficking would argue that it is one of the most important poverty-related issues because they have seen its consequences firsthand. While someone who perhaps lives in a more wealthy or sheltered area and has never been educated on this issue because their risk of falling victim to human trafficking is so low, would say that there are far more critical issues that need addressing before this one. Unfortunately, few people know that being wealthy does not protect you from human trafficking. Living in poverty may be the leading risk factor for human trafficking. Still, other factors such as a history of abuse or mental health struggles also make people far more susceptible. Mitzi Perdue, an anti-trafficking advocate with degrees from Harvard and George Washington University, also a writer for Psychology Today, shares, devastating emotional loss can set up a young person on the path to being trafficked. Perdue suggests that any trauma experienced and often internalized makes everyone a possible target of human trafficking. Therefore, arguments based on the idea that human trafficking is not a severe enough issue to tackle most likely come from the people who lack education on the matter. For society to understand the true dangers of this issue, there must be adequate educational programs in place. Education and policy are the two most important factors in addressing the issue of human trafficking. There are policies in place, but on their own they will not do enough. The most recent policy enacted in the United States was the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2018, which is currently under consideration for reauthorization again. This policy authorized anti-trafficking programs focused on education and prevention, especially for teachers in schools, and strengthened victim support. Another critical policy in the United States government is the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or TVPA, of 2017. The TVPA focuses on the 3 Ps: protection, prevention, and prosecution. This policy is especially important because it focuses on victims rather than perpetrators. It ensures the prosecution of human traffickers, but more so provides support to victims after undergoing such a horrific event. While these policies do a lot of good, they must be updated more frequently to ensure protection from newly developed trafficking tactics and to stop the growth of constantly increasing trafficking rates. Additionally, there needs to be a policy requiring further education on this topic. This should be required training for students in all schools and employees in all workplaces. If people are unaware of the severity of this issue and how they may become targets, it will only continue to worsen. Lastly, the root causes of poverty and inequality must be addressed. This may include making minimum wages higher, expanding government welfare, and providing further support for victims of abuse or those who come from broken homes. Action must be taken to reduce the number of people who feel that they must sacrifice their dignity to survive, because no matter the circumstances, everyone is worthy of dignity and respect. Thank you.